This is Peter Schiff here at SchiffRadio.com. Joining the program now, Edwin Vieira. He's the author of Pieces of Eight, The Monetary Powers and Disabilities of the United States Constitution. He's a practicing attorney. He has been for over 36 years. He specializes in constitutional law. He holds an AB degree from Harvard College, AM and PhD at Harvard Graduate School, and a JD from Harvard Law School. Edwin, welcome to the Peter Schiff Show.
My pleasure to be with you, Peter.
Yeah, so it's a very interesting time, at least when it comes to the hard money arguments. I mean, I've written in my new book that's coming out, and I wrote extensively, too, in The Real Crash, particularly in an appendix that I included about the legal tender laws and the cases that we currently rely on to maybe hold Federal Reserve notes as constitutional. I go over the legal tender cases that took place just after the Civil War. But I clearly make the point in my book that constitutionally only gold and silver coin are legal tender, and that any attempt by the federal government to make anything other than gold and silver coin a tender of payment of debt is clearly unconstitutional and outside of the monetary authorities of the United States. I think really nothing could be clearer than that. I mean, I think it's hard to look at the Constitution, read any of the the founders' arguments about paper money and the Constitution, and to even read the Supreme Court cases and to come to any other conclusion than that.
Well, I think that's right. And all I would add to it, of course, is we're talking there about what the official money of the country can be, because the Constitution does not give Congress or the states any power to interfere with you and me if we were to agree to use something else as a medium of exchange in a private contract. So we're really talking about official money. And I think if you go historically, even before the Constitution, the Articles of Confederation, and then actually in the pre-constitutional history in the colonies and the independent states, you'll see that that's exactly correct, your analysis. Actually, before the Constitution, you had paper money generated by colonial legislatures, independent state legislation, and, of course, Continental Congress with the famous Continentals, not worth a Continental. And it was that experience that caused the Founding Fathers in the Federal Convention, when they were drafting the Constitution, to eliminate the possibility of paper money being generated either by what they called the general government in Washington, D.C., or the states. So the Constitution really couldn't be clearer on its face and from the history leading up to it. But, of course, governments which are interested in redistributing wealth understand that one way to do that is by debasing the currency, and you can debase currency either by removing the gold or silver content or by forcing on the population some kind of non-specie currency, paper currency. And you notice the sequence they went through. They put in paper currency that's redeemable, and then they remove the redemption, and the next thing you find out, you have fiat currency with no connection whatsoever to gold.
Yeah, it was a slow process, boiling the frog. But,
right.
It is amazing, though, when they look at it and they try to claim that it's constitutional. Today they say, well, Congress has the power to coin money. Well, okay, but what does coin money mean? It doesn't mean print money, because if they wanted them to be able to print money, they would have included that power, which back then they called emit bills of credit. Coin money means taking money and making a coin out of it, which, and then what is money? Well, the Constitution says money is gold and silver, because if the Congress coins anything other than gold and silver, it's not legal tender. And then they'll say, well, the federal government can just make it legal tender. No, they can't. The federal government is not giving any constitutional authority to make anything legal tender. It can coin money, but that's it. It can't make something legal tender.
That's right. If you look historically, the Continental Congress had a power to borrow money and emit bills on the credit of the United States. That's the exact language. And that term, emit bills, was the term that the Founding Fathers used for generating paper currency, bills of credit. When the first draft of the Constitution was presented, they took a lot out of the Articles of Confederation. And the first draft had that power in it, the power to borrow money and emit bills on the credit of the United States. And there was a debate. You can read about this in Madison's notes, a very acrimonious debate. And those words, emit bills, were struck from the Constitution. Well, Congress has only the powers that are granted to it. It was proposed, it was struck, ergo Congress doesn't have the power to create paper money. End of discussion.
Yeah, and I think it's even interesting, too, I made this point in my book, The Real Crash, when I went over the legal tender cases, that all of the arguments about the federal government issuing paper money, greenbacks, during and after the Civil War, all of the arguments centered on the necessary and proper clause of the Constitution to save the Union. Nobody even raised the argument that it was in the monetary authority, Article 1, Section 8, that the government had any monetary authority to print money. Everybody conceded that they didn't. It was only a necessary and proper. It was an emergency. The Union was falling apart. And they said, well, to save the Union, can we do this? And, of course, the paper money back then was fully redeemable in gold. I mean, if they tried to say that the Congress they're going to have paper money redeemable in nothing, I mean, there isn't a chance that the court would have said it was okay.
Well, also today, if you look at the situation and compare it to what happened in the Civil War and after the Civil War Treasury greenbacks were issued directly out of the Treasury as the result of a specific appropriation that had been enacted by Congress. Congress told the Treasury, emit so many dollars worth of this paper currency. What we have now is the purported delegation of that power to this private banking cartel, over which Congress has apparently no authority whatsoever to determine how much paper currency or credit the cartel generates. That's all in the power of this Board of Governors interacting with the Federal Reserve regional banks. So even if you could assume that somehow or other Congress and the Treasury could issue paper currency, what is this huge leap to giving a private banking cartel that authority?
Yeah, and then if you compare, the economies of the 19th century and the 20th century, particularly, the latter part of the 20th century, you see, we had sound money, we had gold, we were following the Constitution, and we had deflation and prosperity. And when we veered from the Constitution to paper money, we have inflation, we have depressions, we have these bubbles that keep bursting. And I think we're now on the verge of a collapse in our standard of living. And if you would believe the conventional wisdom that, falling prices and a gold standard are bad, well, then the whole 19th century should have been an economic disaster. Instead, it was the most prosperous period of time in American history.
That's right. One of the interesting things you find at the turn of the century, the American Federation of Labor, which was the big trade union at the time, Samuel Gompers being the president, was very much in favor of hard money. You read the American Federation newspaper at the time, very much in favor of hard money and against central banking, fiat currency, and so forth, because they understood that a hard money system, a gold and silver monetary system, where you had deflation, which really meant increases in the value of money, increases in the purchasing power of money, was to the benefit of the average man, of the wage earner, because most of his wealth was tied up in money.
Mm-hmm. Well,
obviously, the opposite, of course, with the programs of inflation, you're removing value from money, and therefore you're actually lowering the standard of living of the people that supposedly the folks in Washington tell us they're trying to help.
Yes, in fact, it's the wage earner who is being the most impacted. If you take a look at the prices that rise most rapidly as a result of inflation, things like food and energy, which the Federal Reserve doesn't like to count, because I guess if you're a Wall Street investment banker, you don't really care how much your housekeeper pays for groceries because it's a tiny percentage of your overall expenditures. Yet the average laborer who's working in a blue-collar capacity, a much higher percentage of his income goes for things like food and energy, and he gets hit hard from inflation.
That's exactly right. Those are the major targets. It's on the one side of the laborers, and on the other side, the people who are on fixed income, the retired individuals who are watching the value of their pension funds or savings and so forth evaporate. So the two groups that the liberals, if you will, in Washington constantly tell us they want to help are the ones who are the main targets of this policy.
Well, part of the problem is they don't see or they don't admit to the connection. Because if you look at oil prices going up and record high pump prices on a seasonal adjusted basis, what do? They don't blame it on the money printing, on the big deficits. All they can do is say it's because of Iran. It's because of speculators. They accept none of the responsibility for the rising cost of living.
Oh, that's exactly right. And it's exactly the problem, because it deflects people's concern from what the real mechanism is in this process. You talk about inflation, the average person says, well, what that means is increases in prices of food or energy or whatever it may be. But that can't occur unless you have these monetary mechanisms working essentially below the surface. And that's the one thing that they don't want the average person to understand.
Yeah, and of course, it's all going to get so much worse once the foreign central banks who have been absorbing much of the money we've been printing come to their senses and realize that perpetuating the status quo is exacerbating these global economic imbalances. Look at our trade deficit we got last week exploding, the current account deficit exploding, and this is with foreigners buying up all our debt and low interest rates. So we still haven't, really paid the piper on all this money printing. These, these chickens are coming home to roost. And the question is, what is going to happen, which maybe segues me up into the next part of our discussion, which is what's going on, and I know you're involved in this in some respects around the country with a lot of states who are trying to pass their own version of a gold standard within their states.